So I made this documentary in the mid-80s because I was fascinated in tattooing. I was fascinated because it was still very much an underground activity. It had an edge to it, the characters in it were quite fascinating, and it was a world that sort of people really didn't know very much about. I mean, unlike today where there's sort of tattoo parlours on every street corner and there's thousands of tattooists and practically everybody's got a tattoo, back in the 80s it was completely different. Very few people were into tattooing in a serious way, and it had still yet to sort of grow into an art form. So I really wanted to find out what this world was like and penetrate it and win over the confidence of the tattooists, who at that time were very suspicious of the media.
I mean, when you made this film back in the 80s, this was like a real pioneering film. And I'm not just saying it because I'm sitting in front of your camera now, but I mean, your film was about one of only 2 or 3 things you could get on tattooing. Now you open the newspaper and someone's got a tattoo. People are making TV programs about tattooing now. When you started out, you was a real pioneer. I mean, no one was filming us, you know.
Okay. Select 2, take 1. Okay.
If you never done them films, no one would have ever seen Jock. I mean, you're probably the only people who's got actual footage of Jock on VT, you know. And it's such a shame that some of the great ones who went and they was never interviewed.
The 80s was a unique period in tattooing because there was a change from the old school tattooists, for instance, like Jock and Barry Louvaine, who'd been around for a long time, who were being usurped by a whole new generation of tattooists who were very keen to reinvent the image of tattooing in the public's eye and make it accessible to a much wider audience. And the way they did that was by improving what they did creatively vastly, and also by being much more open to the, in the public and having conventions that were open to the public. Because prior to that, tattoo conventions were actually closed to the public. You couldn't go in unless you were a member of the tattoo club. So it was a closed world, and the new tattooists really wanted to change all that. And that's kind of what I wanted to investigate as well. Jock Liddle is a legendary figure in tattooing. He had been tattooing for about 40 years. When I first met him in 1982, he started tattooing with his dad, who was also a tattooist, and tattooed in the travelling circuses, travelling fairgrounds in Scotland. And once he'd learned his trade with his dad, he'd come down to London, where he met George Burchett, who was tattooing in Waterloo Road then. And Burchett's very famous because he tattooed a bunch of aristocracy and kings and queens and the Great Omi and what have you. And he'd bought his first machine actually from George Burchett. I first met Jock when I did a photo shoot for a magazine in his studio in King's Cross. I took my girlfriend at the time, who was an aspiring model, and had her pose with Jock, and he painted on a little tattoo on her arm, and we did the shoot. And it was quite amusing because that time there was a sort of bunch of Hell's Angels waiting in the waiting room, who were all watching and giggling, and generally Jock's studio was a fascinating place to hang out. And I was just spellbound really. I'd sit there all day in this tattoo studio watching people come and go, and from that I got the idea of making Pigments of the Imagination.
Yeah. If you feel anything wet, warm, thick and lumpy in your throat, swallow it. It's your arsehole coming up with it.
Another funny thing he had a piece of pigskin in a frame, and I just assume it's pigskin, but he had a little sign under it saying this was happened to the last person who run out the shop without paying.
Piece of human skin up the top there.
Whose skin's that then?
They belong to a baker.
Oh, it fell off. Yeah, just came off in the road.
I mean, this can't go over there, but I mean, he did refuse to pay and we took it off. I'm telling you.
Today when I look at the tattoo scene, I probably would have still come into it and got tattooed, but it's not as magical as it was for me back then. The characters are not like the Rough Diamonds. They're not today, they're more rock starish, if you know what I mean. I know it sounds silly to say, but when I got into it, you had to know a little bit about the history, you had to be a bit brave because you get clipped round the ear and thrown out the shop. They was all like drinking men, you wouldn't buy a used car off them. There was something really glamorous and really exciting and dangerous about getting tattooed when you was younger, or even going to a shop. It was like going to a backstreet abortionist, You know, they was like locked away in little side streets and things like that. Now you see them in shopping malls and, you know, all over the place, and it's so accepted now.
In the States, it was quite different. For at least a decade, tattooists like Ed Hardy and Lyle Tuttle and a bunch of others had already been experimenting with really radically improving tattooing by incorporating the styles, traditional styles from Japan, Borneo, Polynesia, and sort of mixing it up with Western styling tattooing as well. And this really changed tattooing, and it upped the ante completely. The new wave of tattooists in Britain were catching on to this as well, and were beginning to incorporate these styles and really improve tattooing in a radical way.
He was a big character around this way. He was like a superstar. Everyone knew Barry.
Oh, I love it. Like, yeah, you can drive through the city of London. You can say that's a Barry Louvaine sign, and Barry Louvaine sprayed that statue, and Barry Louvaine painted that. You know, and that's nice. There's a lot of things in London, you know, on people and all that. I can say, well, I did that.
He was another one who made you feel special. I mean, you went in there to sort of see him because you regarded him as something, and he'd sit you down, and you'd feel wonderful. You'd want to meet the man again, you know.
There's an old saying in the tattoo trade: tattooing is done by the uneducated to the uneducated.
Barry was always a character in regards to always had a big cigar in his mouth and always wanted to go around the pub. And never had a cup of coffee in the shop. It was always a cup of whiskey, you know. It was never coffee.
I actually met Van Dyn once, Jacobus Van Dyn, when he first came back from Dutchess.
When he come out of prison, he was on Dartmoor. He'd done the 7 year. He come out of prison, and so that he would never be. What happened? He went to prison because they said he'd done a violent mugging, but he was with another woman at the time, and he got released because they believed the alibi in the end. In court, they didn't believe the alibi, and he got sentenced to 7 years. But then they had an inquiry. Then he was released, and he would said he would never be mistaken identity again. So that's why he got the tattoos on his face.
Jacobus Van Dyn was frequently in the newspapers, and one of the sort of main stories that people read about him was the fact that he was going to sell his own head after his death, that it would be cut off and preserved. And, you know, some of the tattooists like Jock, Cash Cooper, these guys were offered his head to buy it. Unfortunately, none of those tattoos obtained his head, and he was buried, I think, quite normally. So, but it was a brilliant form of publicity for all of them. I agree with the tattooists in the film that facial tattooing is really a disaster. Certainly in the Western world, it's completely taboo. It totally ruins the lives of the individuals who do it. Back in the mid-80s, when I made the film, there were sort of two groups, really punks and skinheads, who were getting into this. And it was largely to do with being very socially alienated, being unemployed, the economy wasn't very good, and generally sort of sticking two fingers up at society and saying, well, we don't want to participate, we're not in the mainstream, we don't ever want to be in the mainstream. And, you know, an incredibly self-destructive thing to do. With Carl, who was the tattooist in the film, who's also facially tattooed, he was inspired by the Rolling Stones album cover Tattoo You, and then decided to have his entire face tattooed. He tried to persuade several tattooists to do it, but they refused, and eventually found one who would do it. And in the interview, if you look closely, you'll see that when I ask him whether he likes it or not, whether he'd want it removed, he says, no, it's all fine. And you'll see him actually, his eyes drop down to the, you know, to his legs, and sort of, kind of, you know, he's lying. And in fact, what he's done to himself has caused enormous pain. When we finished shooting the interview with Carl, we actually went to the pub afterwards to have a drink. And it was a really busy pub, everyone was talking, it was really loud. The minute he walked in the room, you could hear a pin drop. Everybody's just stopped talking and looked at him. And, you know, that is what he'd had to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And it must have drove him completely mad, frankly. Yeah, it was a difficult interview to get because Mr Sebastian was basically who's a cult figure. He's the father of piercing in Great Britain. He was also heavily into the gay S&M scene at that time, and a lot of what he was doing was for that world. And so he wasn't very keen on publicity, so it was actually a bit of a coup to get an interview with him and for him to sort of reveal quite a lot of what he was doing. So that was extremely interesting. I mean, you have to understand that piercing back then was, you know, extreme piercing back then, genital piercing, nipple piercing, lip piercing, was virtually unheard of and considered very taboo. You know, you just didn't see it at all on people.
Mostly it's gay people who find their way to my studio. Not entirely, but mostly.
So Mr Sebastian had some serious problems with the law in England. About 2 years after I interviewed him in 1987, he was arrested along with 16 other gay guys who were involved in consensual S&M activities. And part of those activities involved piercing and genital piercing. And what had happened was that they basically were videoing themselves doing this along with other S&M acts. And the police got hold of one of these tapes and actually thought somebody was being murdered, and investigated the whole bunch and brought charges.
There was a videotape that the guys made, and somehow it got into the hands of a News of the World reporter, and they was knocking nails into their scrotum on bits of wood, and it subsequently ended up in a big court case. So
Mr Sebastian was actually charged with, let me read from my notes here, occasioning actual bodily harm for performing a genital piercing on a client. So remember, this was done in an S&M context, and you know, nobody was doing that at the time, so the police were absolutely horrified. The judge, called amazingly Judge Rant, was the presiding judge over this, and he would not take the consensual nature of these acts into consideration. So the 16 guys were charged. It kind of ruined a lot of their lives. A lot of these guys' lives were ruined by this whole thing. They appealed and it was overturned. And Mr Sebastian ended up being charged with this, and I think he got a, what was it, a sort of 2-year, 15-month sentence that was suspended for 2 years. So he didn't actually go to jail. But it had a big impact on the sort of piercing world. And for a while, it was touch and go that piercing could have been banned in the UK, but fortunately it wasn't.
All right, to someone like my father, he would have been absolutely horrified and said, "Oh, look what these pervs are doing to themselves." But ain't we all pervs in a way? Ain't we? Don't we all like something? You know what I mean? It's why is being straight the right way? You know.